kind of diversity of skills that these guys needed. He notices that, whereas the other guys don't. They just see improvidence. But he sees, well, these guys have to make their own shoes, so they know something about tanning. They're not masters of anything except hunting. Mm-hmm. They have some level of skill in the wide variety of things that are needed, because you can't call anybody.
We are here in Fayetteville, Arkansas, actually right on the square in the Pryor Center, which, Kyle, I've never been here before. Have you?
Nope, never have.
It's a beautiful place in here. I mean, you kind of tucked away off of the main drag, and we're joined on this episode by Dr. Bob Cochran from the University of Arkansas. And Bob, to say that you are an expert in folklore as it relates to Arkansas, the Ozarks, would that be accurate?
I guess it'd be as accurate as almost any other description. I mean, there are things in folklore that I don't care about at all.
Okay.
But if you get me in the areas like you're in, then yeah, I've spent some time doing that.
Well, we're excited to get to spend some time with you and learn from you. You mentioned to me, and as we were talking, you were like, well, here's what we can do. I have an article that I've written, and you sent it to me. I read it. I loved it. I loved the accounts, the contrasting nature that you were able to kind of pull from it. And so the name of the article is called The Gentleman and the Deer Slayer. Do you want to kind of set up what that is and what were the historical accounts of this place?
When I came here, I was from the Midwest, and I didn't know anything about really Arkansas. And the reason I came was the chance to teach folklore and literature together. So I started out really as soon as I got here, trying to find the earliest published accounts of life in Arkansas. And as it turns out, there were, 5 or 6 of them. And over the next 4 or 5 years, I both read these, I found these accounts and read them and wrote little short articles about it. One thing you might not know is that assistant professors in English don't make a whole lot of money.
Okay.
And so, my bachelor's degree was in journalism. I always knew that I wanted to write, and write for publication. So there were little magazines. There was a month, sort of a Arkansas equivalent, short-lived Arkansas equivalent of Texas Monthly, published out of Little Rock. And the editors of that published some of the short articles that I wrote about this. And the one you read was actually an academic article, published in the Arkansas Historical Quarterly.
Right.
But I sort of made a habit of doing that, reading one of these articles and writing just about that particular traveler.
Okay.
And now to move toward what after I'd read a number of them, I realized that they grouped themselves into 2 groups. One of them very well represented, and one of them represented by only one guy. Mm-hmm. You could modify that a little, but it worked generally. That most of the travelers were scientists. I'll just pick one example. Thomas Nuttall was an English-born botanist. And in 1819, he came up the Arkansas River, so that his experience of Arkansas was always close to the river. And he turned around at Fort Smith. I mean, he made a very short trip over in the Indian Territory, I think. And he published his account. But what he was primarily interested in was plants. And he made collections of plants and described plants. And that's just one example. Another guy was a guy named Schoolcraft, Henry Rowe Schoolcraft. Let's see, Nuttall was 1819. It was almost the same year, 1818. Schoolcraft was looking for lead deposits and mining interests.
He was a geologist, wasn't he?
No, that's Featherston.
Oh, okay.
And Featherston, he's another guy, an English guy. And he was a geologist, yeah.
Okay.
And he went to Hot Springs. The guy thought he died and gone to heaven, because and for a geologist, he would, that's where else would you want to be,
Sure.
right? So, and all these guys come to Arkansas, but they're not interested in Arkansans. They're interested in plants and, hot springs and lead deposits.
Yeah.
And they publish their accounts. And Featherston's the last one of this group. He comes in the 1830s. So for the by the time I'd read all those, I'd gotten I'd read 4 works that focused on between 1800 and 1840. And then I discovered Gear-Stalker, which is where we're headed with this. He wasn't even an American; he was a German.
With a name like Gear-Stalker,
yeah,
you gotta be.
Friedrich Gear-Stalker, right? And he comes here, and he's much younger than he's in his 20s, And his reason to come to Arkansas is a little bit crazy. He read Cooper novels. He read the Leatherstocking novels, and they're sort of romances of the forest and prairie. And he wanted to hunt. I mean, you want in one sentence is he came and he wanted to be Leatherstocking. He wanted to live the life of a fictional character in Cooper's novels. Well, he was interested in Arkansans. So they grouped in, you have these sort of gentleman scholars who just, and all this, they come here and their observations about the people and the society are disparaging.
Mm-hmm.
They're not impressed.
They're downright brutal in some
They're
cases.
absolutely brutal, yeah. And part of the comedy for me is the language that they use. I mean, because they're Victorian era. That's the era of the writing, and we can give some examples of that. But right away, you got these guys. Their comments are interchangeable. You could take the comments of one and make it believably fit in another one. And then there's Gear-Stalker, who had a great time the whole time he was here. He traveled widely in the state. He came as close to here as St. Paul, down there on the pig trail going. Yeah, I mean, one of his most famous bear hunts was, down right near there. And I know people who have tried to find places, that are listed, you sort of described, but I never did any of that. But so that's it basically, and that part of folklore really interested me.
Yeah. Just
interestingly enough, the thing you mentioned that you said, well, let's do some Halloween stuff about some more. I'm not interested in that.
Yeah.
So that's a part of folklore.
Well,
that
I'm thankful you aren't, because after we talked for just a little bit, we started realizing, no, the actual history is way cooler than, I don't know, 30 minutes of made up stuff.
Yeah, spooky stories and stuff.
Yeah. So if I sounded a little suspicious at first, that I get a lot of requests.
Yeah.
For spooky stories and stuff like that.
Oh, I'm sure.
Ghost stories, treasure hunting stories. I'm not, and so. But then, since Clay, and I knew that you were interested in this other stuff, I was eager. But I've had a fair amount of experience being asked to.
Oh, I'm sure with Eureka Springs being so close. All that stuff too. It makes sense.
Yeah, no, I'm glad that you're eager, because I'm eager. And what I really kind of wanted to do, so we talked a lot about Arkansas. We also, I asked you, hey, is there anything that we can sprinkle in for Missouri? Because, we're talking about a time period where really Arkansas wasn't even a state yet. I mean, Arkansas didn't become a state until 1836. And so the lines to me, the boundaries, when you talk about the Ozarks, it's a little blurred. And so I want to go into just some of those early accounts of the gentleman, as you described, some of the stories that they tell about the people, about the kind of the things that they witness as they're here. What were some of those early accounts of the gentleman scientists who really were detractors of the area in their writings back to civilized America on the East Coast?
Okay, well, maybe a good one to start with is Schoolcraft. I mean, one of the things Schoolcraft does, he was often frightened while he was here. He would, he'd stop to sleep in some tavern that would pass as a motel for that day.
Okay.
And usually there would be some sort of, gambling or drinking going on. And he was often terrified. So one of my favorite stories, and it has a comic dimension, although he doesn't intend it to be comic. He spent Christmas with two families, the Holt and Fisher families, in the sort of upper White River. And while he was there, two boys got into a fight and stabbed each other. And they weren't seriously wounded. I mean, they weren't mortally wounded anyway, but
right.
they recovered. And he says that what shocked him the most was that no punishment by the parents was administered in either case.
Really?
And then but that's only the first half of the sentence. He says that they seem to take it in stride, that their sons had knifed each other, But he says that it was seen as a promising character trait. That was so no punishment, but they were spirited young men. They weren't going to take any.
Stand up for yourself.
That's right. They're going to stand up for themselves. So they'll just bandage them up and look forward to their next adventure. But the phrasing in the book was that no punishment was administered. The behavior was seen as a positive character trait.
Wow.
So that sort of thing, I think, just tells you volumes about, and you can find that addressed in sort of scholarly language and Schoolcraft was very sensitive to the how women were raised, and he was sensitive to that, and he said that they were this is raised to servile employment. So they were, in other words, they were working the whole time. And so you can see there that there's an attitude that women are raised to a subservient station in life, and the men are raised to have their willpower developed. That's what you need on a frontier. That's why you've got the guy with the gun out in front and the woman following behind.
Women and children behind.
Women and children behind, So just in that one little line, you see, okay. So it's easy to make fun of it. It's a comic phrase, but you see in that the kind of inculcation of a kind of value system that's going to pay off. In a frontier situation.
Right. Kind of molded people to become what they had to be to survive in this environment that was so harsh and undeveloped.
Yeah. And these little boys that are stabbing each other, if they survive their childhood, they'll be capable and not intimidatable. They will be well suited to the environment that they're in. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, and you talk about stuff surviving today. I mean, when I first moved here, I lived out in Winslow, and some guy started messing with my, putting up sort of clothesline fences on my land. And of course I'm a city guy. So, I hire a lawyer and all this stuff. But
you're going to fight in the courts.
Yeah. But when there was a gas station in Brentwood that I became sort of, I like to listen to the old guy who ran it. And I told him that I'd had this problem. And his advice, which I thought he was joking, but he said to me, he says, that guy, he's always doing stuff like this, says, so here's what you do. You just drive over to his house and tell him if he does it again, you'll kill him. And I said, just in my thought, I said, well, that's not an act I'm capable of. I'm
not sure he'll believe me.
Yeah, I don't think I could be a convincing, threatening killer. But it seemed to me that the guy was entirely serious. Mm-hmm. That you just hiring a lawyer is wasting your money. You just go over there and tell the guy, stop her, or you'll kill him. And this was 1977 or something,
Still an attitude in modern day.
Yeah. So I know that's sort of a digression, but you had mentioned, how these things are persistent.
Yeah.
These attitudes are persistent.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you about Schoolcraft. That's a name that we've heard of a lot in doing the podcast and different people mentioning. I've specifically heard Schoolcraft mentioned as a reference to the Ozarks habitat. years and years ago when there was more regular prescribed burning. I think it was Schoolcraft who mentions you could ride through the Ozarks without knocking the hat off of your head, basically alluding to the fact that there just weren't as many trees. It was more open prairies and grasslands and upland savannas and things of that nature. And so I've heard his name, but tell me a little bit more about Schoolcraft and just what he was doing here and where he was coming through in Arkansas and in the Ozarks and what his purpose was as he was kind of on this mission at taking these accounts.
Okay. He started from St. Louis. He traveled with a partner named Levi Pettibone. And he was checking out mining opportunities, specifically lead mining things. I didn't know it when I moved to Arkansas, but there's a town called Galena in Missouri. The Galena is evidently some sort of lead compound or something. And so there was thought to be real mining opportunities. I don't know whether you know, there's a little town, it's a ghost town now because it's been ruined by the mining. Pitcher, Oklahoma, Picher.
I'm not familiar.
It's in extreme sort of northeast Oklahoma. That was a mining town. So, and then, there's bauxite, there's stuff in India. So there's a lot of extractive mining opportunities. There's two things you brought up. You brought up what he was doing, and that was thing, and that that was part of his purpose. Mm-hmm. He was supposed to find that, but he also noticed the clearing out of understory in the woods, and that was an Indian practice, as you know, and so I think he did observe that and could see why it would be a useful practice, not necessarily an accident or something like that.
Right.
Yeah. So, I mentioned him being afraid. One of the great things is in one of the places that he stopped, he says that he and his partner were so frightened by what went on in the tavern that they got back on the river at first light. They were evidently at this point on the river, because he says on the river at first light. And here's what I remember precisely: the phrase happy to have escaped bodily disfiguration, and so when you're reading through this stuff and you get to something like that, your pleasures are on several levels.
Yeah.
You're learning about the sort of tolerance for violence, which is there in that Christmas story, and this is the little kid who's knifing his buddy when they happen to get at loggerheads. When he grows up, he's probably going to spend a night in one of these places.
Yeah. So essentially, he was just literally happy to get out of there without facing bodily disfigurement.
Yeah.
That was the joy. That was like the cap to the night. Was like, I made it out alive. My head is still on my shoulders.
That's right. Yeah. And he usually condemns the owner of the place. He says, and then usually you get this line in more than one. The owner of the establishment, rather than guaranteeing the safety of his guests, is actively promoting the drinking.
Oh my gosh!
And the gambling and all that. So it's like I said, a lot of the lines are interchangeable.
These guys like Schoolcraft and others who are coming through the Ozarks, where were they coming from that was such a different world than the, at least in their mind, uncivilized kind of wilderness area of the Ozarks? And I guess I'm asking because had the West pretty much been settled and bigger cities were established and the coast were established, and then you find kind of this middle heartland America and the rest of the world doesn't know what to do with it? Or was kind of the frontiersman still a predominant figure at this time in the early to mid 1800s?
Well, I think that and this would be true of Missouri as well. Schoolcraft is primarily associated now with the upper Midwest because he was a relatively young guy in this thing. I mean, younger, not as young as Gear-Stalker, but a relatively young guy. And he went on to become a quite famous student of Indian cultures. He's in sort of Wisconsin, Minnesota, up there. That's where his reputation is now. So the mining thing was a passing thing with him. He may have been working for someone. I don't know that.
Like a chartered trip to go figure something out.
Yeah, he may have been scouting for mining opportunities in the employ of somebody else, or maybe just on his own. I'd guess on his own, because I don't remember reading that he was employed by somebody.
Yeah, maybe he's thinking if the gold rush could happen in the Rockies, maybe the lead rush could happen in the Ozarks.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah, and another thing about those guys that's comic is they were both, Pettibone and Schoolcraft they were in a hunter's paradise. I mean, there was game going by them, and they couldn't shoot it. They didn't know how to hunt anything.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they nearly starved.
Oh, no way.
No, there are places where they're reduced to, a turkey, and there's bears and deer. I mean, you get a kind of comic impression of these guys in a hunter's paradise who simply lack the most basic hunting skills. It would be like me. Yeah. I mean, you could give me a gun and send me out in the woods. I wouldn't know how to shoot anything. Yeah. And so I had a certain amount of sympathy for these guys, but you couldn't read the thing and not see that they must have just been frustrated. And the people, when they would stop and some family would be there, and the wives would tell them, the first day they were out of St. Louis, I don't know what kind of weaponry they were carrying, but the wife of the family that they first stayed with said, that gun you have is worthless where you're headed. I don't know what, yeah. That's not a good gun for where you're headed. Yeah. And it was the wife who was telling him.
Yeah. He probably had like a 22 short
Who
rifle
knows
or something.
yeah. I mean, and they're true babes in the woods out there.
So they were very out of their element.
Completely.
Very uncomfortable, not just with the people, but just the environment.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a good point. I never really thought of it to bring them together like that.
Yeah.
But yeah.
What about you mentioned Silas Turnbo, and I know he was kind of one that you mentioned as, here's some accounts from Missouri.
Yeah.
If we mix in some of the Missouri stories, I know you've got kind of a few here. What was Silas Turnbo? What was his purpose? What was he doing? And then what were some of the accounts that he witnessed?
Yeah, given what I've already said, in some ways you'd make him be closer to Gear-Stalker.
Okay.
Because he likes it.
Okay.
He likes the people. So he's later. He's actually later. He doesn't die till 1925. I think it's fair to say, I'm sure that it's fair to say that none of the other guys get anywhere near 1900, before they die.
Right.
So he's later, but he liked these things and he consciously collected stories. He's alone in that with any of the people we're talking about. So that he tried to sell them, as I think I mentioned earlier. He self-published little volumes of stories. And by this time he's already sort of romancing the Ozarks, this hunting culture and the adventures of the hunting life with bear and deer and there's little sections on panthers and other things too.
Gotcha.
So he's a little bit different, but and he's consciously trying to sell it.
Gotcha. Well, I want to save him then because I want to go through some of the other detractors, and then we'll come back to Turnbo. So you've mentioned Schoolcraft, you've mentioned Pettibone. Who haven't we mentioned from that kind of early group of gentlemen scientists?
We already mentioned Nuttall.
That's
too.
right.
Yeah, the botanist.
Yep.
So the very earliest one, the earliest of the ones that were available, and I should say something about scholarship too. These things got published in the 19th century, and then of course they fell out of print. And one thing that's happened in my lifetime is a kind of effort of scholarship. When I first came to Arkansas, this book hadn't been published, the Schoolcraft thing. The guy named Milton Rafferty sort of took that old book and followed the path, did a real scholarly attempt to map the journey and things like that. When I first came here in the 70s, The only one that had been done in this kind of modern scholarly edition was Nuttall's thing. The University of Oklahoma Press had published the equivalent of this Schoolcraft one.
Okay.
The one we really have talked the least about is Featherston. And I say Featherston, but it's spelled in an odd way, and the English pronunciation is like, Shakespeare plays the names of
bunch of extra letters.
Yes, But I've heard that it's supposed to be even pronounced Fanshawe, but it's spelled like feather, stone, haw, Haugh. And as I said, he's a geologist. But he had the same responses to the people, even though he's a little bit later. He's right around statehood time. He's 1834, with becoming a state in 1836.
Yeah.
And he comes in, and he's traveling with his son. And they go to Hot Springs. They travel around a lot, spend some time in Little Rock, exit the state by going to New Orleans on a steamer. Everything I've said about Schoolcraft and Nuttall applies to Featherston, except he wasn't afraid. He was not afraid at all. He was a belligerent guy. And so,
how so?
Well, he said some guy, he really despised what he called the Arkansas gentleman, we're always talking about the code of honor, and duels and having all that kind of thing.
Okay.
And he calls them puppies. He's an old guy, but he's an old British Tory. He's an old British aristocrat. And he's not the least bit afraid. I mean, he's just like Winston Churchill kind of guy, and so he says some guy threatens him on the steamboat headed out of Arkansas. He doesn't seem to realize that New Year's gets celebrated. And so he's shocked at this party that's developing, but it's December 31st, right?
He's just clueless to the timing.
He's clueless to it. But this guy threatens him, and he says, considering his youth, I checked my temper and told him that if he took one more step to him, I would put him to death instantly. I mean, it was that kind of thing. And so, he's very aggressive.
Yeah.
But except for that, he's not afraid. But except for that, you could pass him off as the same attitudes. When subservience of women, no interest in education. We haven't talked about that, but over and over, these guys lament the fact that there's no education, there's no public school system, and the only schools would be what they called subscription schools, where a group of people living relatively close to each other would hire a teacher, and they would pay the teacher for a certain term and he would teach their kids. So it would be a parentally described or parentally subscribed education, and they all lamented that. They thought it was terrible, and they were all religious guys. Unlike Gear-Stalker, again, Gear-Stalker
he's an anomaly.
Yeah, he's an anomaly again. He doesn't care about education, and he's not Christian.
He's there to hunt.
Yeah, he's there to hunt bears and other animals.
How would he categorize the Arkansas gentleman? You'd mentioned that before the New Year's story. What was his view of the Arkansas gentleman?
You mean Featherston?
Featherston.
Yeah, he despised them. He thought they were loud and obnoxious, and they were always threatening each other, with duels and
So even the kind of upper class of society of the time, that they would categorize themselves as gentlemen, he's looking down on, going, not even close.
That's right.
Got it.
And he's so belligerent that he's not afraid of them, whereas Schoolcraft and Nuttall would have fled.
Yeah, they're not challenging them. Challenging them back.
Yeah. But he said they're always talking about honor, and it's that code of dueling,
What were their opinions of people here and how they spent their time? You mentioned lack of education, but what were their observations of how the people in the Ozarks spent their time?
Well, I think that it's funny you ask that, because I think it's kind of an inaccurate observation, but most of the time, this is especially true of the earliest guys, the guys that came up the Ouachita River to Hot Springs from the south. They started in Louisiana and came up into Arkansas. And this is also true of different groups of people, the people who first chronicled the Arkansas Post down in southeast Arkansas. They thought they partied all the time.
Really?
But yeah, they had the kind of language they would use, that they had an obsessive interest in balls, in dances, and partying. So I think it was, they were improvident. They didn't look out to the future. So the description is really quite coherent. They don't look to the future. A lot of times when they came up in Dunbar and Hunter came up from Louisiana, they saw it was really early. It was, I want to say, 1805. Yeah, 1805. There were really rare outposts. There weren't even little towns for the most part. If it was big, it was a fort. It was a military post.
Right.
They'd describe how small the place was. One in particular, he said the cabin was 15 feet square, and no floor, one bed for a man and his wife and 4 kids. You can go buy you can buy these postcards in drugstores today. That show. When I teach classes on this stuff, I'd go to Collier's and buy all these sort of Ozark postcards. I'm sure you've seen them. Guy laying up against a tree with a jug of whiskey and his wife,
sure.
Plowing the field.
Yeah.
It's very easy. This is just to revisit that notion. It's very easy to see the persistence of that stereotype. But this guy in 1805, he's dead serious. He said the guy is laid in no corn. It's coming winter. And, these guys are likely, these guys will be lucky to even survive. So they're a coherent group.
Yeah. And they basically, at this point, you have these 4 or 5 different accounts. And in your article, I love it. It's so clear that like now you jump to Gear-Stalker, and his perspective is so different. But essentially, they've painted this picture of people who have never been to this area, and they're in these writings, and they've painted this picture to them of this place is uncivilized, it's violent, these people are uneducated, they don't think about the future, they would rather hunt than plant agriculture and crops. It's like this terrible image of people. And then along comes Friedrich Gear-Stalker.
Yeah.
And his account is completely different.
Completely different. Couldn't be more different.
How so?
Well, first of all, he thinks, if the people are having parties, he likes parties, So he enjoys dancing, and the fact that he's a good hunter, that gives him a kind of cachet with them. He's already an experienced hunter.
And he's from Germany, but within America, where is he coming from?
Well, he got here as quickly as he could. He got off the boat somewhere on the East Coast. I've forgotten where he got off.
Okay.
But he hightailed it for what was at that time a kind of frontier. And he's late. He's even 4 years after Gear-Stalker. He arrives in Arkansas in 1838.
Okay.
And stays till 1842. And he covers a great deal of the state. He's everywhere. And he wants to hunt. And he gets here pretty quickly. And he stays. And when he leaves, he salutes the state. I could look it up for you, but his journal says, I said farewell. We're almost the same place that Featherston. He left to go into New Orleans. So where Featherston is saying, he's never seen such a despicable mob in his life. The Gear-Stalker takes his pen and says, look, I bid farewell to this place where I met some of the most wonderful people I've ever known. And he thought they were hospitable to him. He used that word all the time. He stayed 6 weeks. Think of that. So, guests get old after 3 days.
With one family.
One family. Yeah. He stayed 3 days, and guests start to outstay their welcome.
Yeah.
He stayed 6 weeks with the family. And when he leaves, he said that he was so moved by that he found it necessary to dissemble his, he had to hide himself away lest he tear up or something with. I mean, it's
he didn't want to get emotional in front of these people.
That's right. That's right.
Wow.
And the adjectives he uses, the men are even an old man. He uses the language that you use for a distinguished older citizen, and hale and hearty despite his years, and the wife would be a worthy matron or something like that, and he's in every gesture, he's still living in that world of Cooper novels.
Yeah.
And he thinks these are living people from that period. And so he reads it positively. And he's very tolerant, by the way, of violence. He goes hunting with a guy who said he was rumored to have had a fondness for stolen horse flesh. And he says, but he says, it didn't matter to me. He couldn't steal one of mine because I didn't have a horse, So he couldn't be more opposite. That's the thing that sort of fueled that article that you read. Is just point for point they contrast.
That is so interesting. So he's come here. He's about it. Like, he takes it in stride, even the violence, even the bad stuff. He kind of puts that aside and sees what he wants to see from the novels he's read, and he takes it on and really kind of becomes a part of the culture. And in doing so, has a completely different perspective than the previous accounts. I wonder if he had, and I don't know if you would know this, but I wonder if he had read the accounts of the other earlier gentlemen and kind of been challenged by what he read and then what he experienced himself.
I'd have to say I don't think so, but I'm not sure of that. But I thought while you were talking, I thought of one example. There's an incident in Gear-Stalker's reporting where he reports of a fight in a tavern in Ozark, down in Ozark.
Oh yeah,
and he says,
home of the Hillbillies.
Yeah, and he says this phrase is part of his thing. He says, "My knife was out with everyone else's." I mean, he pulls his own knife to defend himself. So he was ready to administer bodily disfiguration if he had to, not just fearing that he's going to be subjected to it.
Mm-hmm.
So on the one hand, all of the gentlemen except Featherston are terrified of bodily disfiguration.
Yeah.
And this guy, this is what's required. Well, yes, I happen to have my own knife.
Yeah.
So
I'm ready when you are.
Yeah. So it just appealed to me to write that article with that sense to, it gave me my title.
Yeah. The Gentleman in the Deer Sleigh.
Yeah.
So what were some of his other stories of either hunts he had been on or just kind of some of his high points of his travels in Arkansas that you think really landed for him and kind of made that his perspective?
Three things. I think he admires he's a young man, and I think he admires old frontiersmen. There's a guy he names Slow Trap in his thing, who he treats as a kind of fountain of wisdom. And the kind of diversity of skills that these guys needed, he notices that, whereas the other guys don't. They just see improvidence. But he sees, well, these guys have to make their own shoes, so they know something about tanning. They know, in other words, they're not masters of anything except hunting,
mm-hmm.
but they have some level of skill in the wide variety of things that are needed, because you can't call anybody. If something breaks, you got to fix it.
Yeah, and your nearest neighbor could be who knows how far away.
That's right. So, anyway, I said there were three things. The first thing is that his admiration for older men who are sort of patriarch figures. They have families. They provided for their families, and have the skills to do that. There is a great deal of stories about hunting, and the featured hunts are bear hunts. he doesn't have featured stories about hunting deer or panthers or anything else. His featured hunting stories tended to be bear hunts. And maybe the one that he gives the most extensively is the one down near St. Paul.
Okay.
A guy gets killed by a bear in that fight, and he's moved by that. I mean, he sees that for all the romance of hunting bears, that one slip, one mistake, and you could be a dead guy.
Wow.
So for the old guys, bear hunts, and then he has a particular weakness for families. I don't know anything about Gear-Stalker's life in Germany before he came over here, but not knowing that, I would guess that maybe he didn't come from the warmest family background, because he is an absolute sucker for that. He'll land in this and like this near it's near St. Paul. I think he spends 6 weeks with this family.
Yeah,
like I said. Well, the hospitality of that is astonishing. The hospitality of them welcoming him. Now he could probably pay his way. He probably hunted successfully with them. But those three things, I think, stand out in his thing.
Yeah.
When he goes home, this is an interesting little thing. He was famous because his mother had collected some of his letters to her and published his accounts. So he returned.
Back in Germany.
Yeah, and in German, and he became, he arrived back home to find that he was a well-known author.
Wow.
And he wrote sort of river pirates. I mean, he wrote a thing in German called the River Pirates of the Mississippi. And there are some scholars who say that's the first Western. So he shows
cool.
up.
That's awesome.
He shows up in sort of histories of the Western as a literary genre.
Man, that is cool.
Yeah.
So have any of those letters, I'm assuming that since you know about it, they've been written in English or translated to English now. You're not saying that there's German literature over in Germany still that depicts the Ozarks that we maybe don't know about? Would that be? No, the thing that it got translated by an awkward title, but it has gotten some of the same treatment that these things have. Okay, gotcha.
They were published in Germany. They've been translated. The copy I own in my office is called Wild Sports of the Far West or something like that. And I don't read German, but I can read enough of the title that title does not, it's not Wild Sports of the Far West.
Yeah.
And so it's been translated into English.
Gotcha.
And people who study Westerns as their primary interest have often sort of include him as a sort of founding article.
Oh, that is super
founding
cool.
author.
That is very cool. Okay, now I want to circle back to Silas Turnbo. So we've heard from Gear-Stalker. Now back to kind of Missouri. He's another guy who really he wanted to hunt. He came here looking for the pursuits, the romantic idea of the Ozarks. What was his perspective and what was he doing?
Okay. It was Gear-Stalker that did that. Right. Turnbo didn't. Turnbo was, I think, actually born here or reasonably close to it.
Okay.
But sometime in middle life, Turnbo started to consciously collect stories about hunting and about old-timer life. And he tried without success to make a living at it, to produce books of stories that he'd collected from people. But the main thing to think of is that he gets up in the morning and goes out looking for old timers. And he asks, when he comes to a community, he asks, and it's his own community.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, part of his own family gets prominent treatment in the book.
Okay.
But he certainly branches out. And when he hears that there's an old timer in someplace, he goes and talks to him.
He's like a podcaster.
Yeah, he's like a podcaster.
If he had a podcast.
Or a folklorist, right? So
he would have gone and recorded these conversations.
That's right. He would have. And this book, the White River Chronicles of S.C. Turnbo, they had a complex history because he You know, he ended, I mean, this is a sad story. At the end of his life, he gave up. He'd published, you know, I told you before we got on the air, a 1903, 1905, he publishes this Fireside Tales of the Ozarks thing, tries to sell it for 50 cents, you know. But at the end of his life, he was out of energy. He sold all of his writings for $27 to a book dealer, you know, from Kansas City or somewhere, who ended up selling it, or there might have been a couple of owners in between, but the library in Springfield, Missouri, bought it.
Okay.
And then now people have published it. And this, you know, the University of Arkansas Press published this. And it's only a small part of it. I mean, the very first line in this thing says, we have taken 400, the editors took 2487 pages of type material and selected 425 pages for this book.
Wow.
So
it's just a small subset of his stories.
It's a small subset of his stories, but they're positive. I mean, he admires the people. So that's why, just speaking generally, I grouped him with Gear-Stalker.
Right.
He's a fan.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
And he's a fan. He's a native fan. He, unlike these other guys who come from, you know, the more settled regions of the East Coast, or in Gear-Stalker's case, Germany, and in Featherston's case, England. He's from here. Mm-hmm. He's from this area.
And he had some stories. I know we kind of wanted to talk through some of these that were just kind of wild, kind of cool. If you want to, here you've written down "Man Fights Bear." I think that's one that people would want to hear.
All right, sure. Let's have a look at that one. I got a little bit away. I'm sorry about that.
No, you're good. And take your time looking it up.
I've got it. I'm right here. So let me see. Yeah, the title he uses is "How a Boasting Fellow." See, you know right away that this guy's going to get his comeuppance. How a boasting fellow was vanquished by a little bear. I'm going to start with the first time they see a bear. They said this bear was what hunters call a full bear, or a runt. Was brown in color and a year old. Bruin was basking in the sun and was resting quiet. We told our companion in a jocular way that now was the time to show his bravery, for yonder was a bear waiting for the attack. The man replied that he did not desire to belittle himself by jumping on such a puny-looking creature as that bear looked to be. I want to fight a bear, he said. That's more of an equal match for me. But, continued the man, rather than miss a fight, I will slap it a few times to see it cut up to get out of my way. We had no thought the man actually intended to attack the bear, but to see him back out, as we supposed, we landed the canoe 150 yards below the log the bear was on. And believing we would bluff him, we all went ashore. The little bear did not appear to notice. Apparently it was asleep. We now passed up the bank and made a circuit through the dense cane and approached that part of the shore where the log was. The bear did not move, but from the manner it was breathing, it was in a deep slumber. To our surprise, the man still showed his inclination to fight the bear. We told him it was dangerous to do so, for the beast might kill or cripple him. But he insisted, so strong, to be allowed to attack Bruin. And finally, seeing that the man was in earnest, we gave up persuading him and agreed to let him tackle it and told him to go. As the fellow started into the water, to wade out to the end of the log where the bear lay, he said, "Now, men, don't show any foul play in my favor, but you can help the bear if you feel like it." As he waded along at the side of the water, in the side of the log, the water increased in depth, but the deepest place was not over 2 1/2 feet. The noise and bluster the man made as he went along through the water roused little Bruin from his nap, and slowly raised up on his feet and turned around with his head toward his foe. And after eyeing him an instant, he started and walked along the log to escape into the forest. The man now halted, and just as the bear was passing him, the man, by a skillful movement, jerked the bear from the log into the water and dealt it a blow with his clenched hand, and the battle began. The man being robust and very stout, and Bruin being so small in size and thin at flesh, it seemed that the man might overpower it. While the fight progressed, the combatants worked nearer to the shore, where the water was 18 inches deep. Here the belligerents settled down to desperate fighting. The water splashed and foamed. The young boaster struck the bear with his hands and kicked it with all his strength. Little Bruin returned the compliments by biting and striking the man with his paws. It was a busy contest as much as it was interesting and amusing. We cheered both man and beast. As the battle went on, we noticed that Little Bruin was getting the better of the man, but we continued to cheer for both of them. Sometimes we would hurrah for the bear alone and then for the man, and at times we would halloo for man and beast together. In a few minutes more, we saw plainly that the man was badly worsted, but knowing we could interfere before the man was severely injured, and that he requested us not to show foul play for the bear, we let them continue the combat and went on with our cheering. And I'm going to skip down to the end because it goes along. Although he was not seriously hurt yet, he was the worst whipped man I ever saw, and we enjoyed many hearty laughs at his expense. This incident put a quietus on his boasting as to his prowess as a bear fighter. We saw more bear as we went up the river and back again, and when we would catch sight of one, we would tantalize him by saying, "There's another bear. Do you want to fight it?" And his invariable reply was, "No, I don't volunteer to fight any more bear." This book is filled with this stuff like that. I mean, that's typical stuff.
So that is a kind of a depiction of, these are some of the characters that inhabited the Ozarks at the time.
Right.
They spent their time hunting, fighting bears, telling stories, and really not that much different than I think sometimes what we see today as far as people who hunt, and with a great caveat that I have never met anyone who's fighting bears with hand and fist. But it's not that different than a group of buddies hanging out today at deer camp, telling stories, daring each other to go do something kind of funny. This is just kind of the way of life, the normal way of life back then.
Yeah, and then there's a little part of me that, remember, I got hired as a folklorist, as an English teacher. The first book I wrote down here was the biography of Vance Randolph, the Ozark folklorist.
Yeah.
And he has a story in one of his Ozark folktales collections called Tobe Killed a Bear. And it's a figure, Tobe is a man, and Tobe is not a braggart like the guy in this story. Tobe is assisting a woman whose house is being, an old woman who lives by herself, and she's worried about a bear that's coming up on her porch. And he says, "Well, I'll come over and I'll fight the bear," and he does. Well, I don't know whether you remember this from high school English, but there's a story in Old English called Beowulf.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Beowulf fights bear. In fact, it's the name Beo is bear.
Okay.
So in other words, it's a really ancient story trope, a story center or sort of type of story. And this story, comes very close to that. I mean, it changes the character of it. In most of them, the Beowulf figure is a hero, as in Tobe Killed a Bear, Randolph's story. Every time I read that story of Randolph's, I wonder whether the guy actually told that story or whether Randolph just Ozarked Beowulf.
Ozarked Beowulf.
Yeah, you know what I mean?
Put his own spin on it.
Yeah. Because there's a suspicious number of really famous stories that Randolph has turned out as Ozark folktales.
Yeah.
Chaucer. There's Chaucer stories that show up in his books. So there's laughs involved in it too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I have a question for you that could be a little long, but we've heard some history, some hunting stories. I know we have a couple more hunting stories. If we get to them, we want to hear. But we're hearing about how the frontiersmen and their family in the Ozarks were maybe some of the last kind of true Renaissance men of early American history. And I mean, that's not a definitive claim. People had to survive. Mm-hmm. But some accounts are saying they're lazy, they're not planting, they're not doing anything. Other accounts are saying they're actually a little bit good at everything, really good at one thing. Moving into just kind of the spirit of the Ozarks in Arkansas and Missouri and what people had to do to survive, and the Ozark gentleman and the bravado that comes with that could also be lent towards bragging and kind of a bigger than life fictional character of kind of men in the Ozarks, specifically outdoorsmen. My question is how much of that spirit kind of carried into modernity and kind of the Ozarks that we know today, and what are the best parts of that you think led to a place like the Ozarks flourishing, and then what are some of the worst character traits that you see that maybe people from Arkansas and Missouri are unwilling to let go of because it's just a part of who they are, even though the rest of the world may look down on it and go like, that's just not normal anymore, man. What are kind of the two rising identifiers that you see that have carried on really in the last 200 years, from the early 1800s now the early 2000s?
Well, on the positive side, I guess that sense of competence, a kind of broad-based competence. I'll give you an example because it's something that I'm particularly poor at. But the last book I just wrote is a book about an Arkansas author named Charles Portis, the guy that wrote True Grit. And one of the things that was quite clear in his works is a man is expected to be able to take care of his car. Well, you don't even have cars back in the times that we're talking about.
Right.
But, knowing a little about everything,
You do they would have had to take care of their horses.
Yeah, you got to take
gear, their guns.
That's right. And the current equivalent is your truck, right? The current equivalent. And a guy like myself because I felt personally, if something goes wrong with my car, and I don't care what it is, anything goes wrong with my car, I do not tell myself that I can fix it. I take it directly to the dealer or whoever is, my mechanic.
Yeah.
And sometimes I've been laughed at because, it turns out that, a fuse is blown or something, something very minor. So I think there remains in this culture. I wouldn't know where to draw the line. But I came from Indiana, and I don't think that a person in Indiana would have felt as exposed to criticism if he knew absolutely nothing about cars. Whereas, if I'm out there in the world living out in Winslow and, I have a flat tire and I'm exaggerating now.
Sure,
Even I can do this, but now I'm getting pretty old, so I might not be real quick about changing a tire. But, that I would feel exposed to criticism here more than I would have, I think, in Indiana.
Mm-hmm.
So on the positive side, I think a kind of sense of a kind of minimal competence in a broad range of activities as a signifier of competence, not just for men, but for women as well. I think that women would be expected to know about canning and know about, traditionally female, things. On the negative side, I don't know. The obvious thing to cite is, given what I do for a living, teaching, is I think that just today even, maybe more than any time since I moved to Arkansas, teachers and librarians and people like that are subject to criticism, and disrespect in ways that would be greater than in most other parts of the country. So that I think that, the lack of respect for education is probably would be the most thing. Now, I would be sensitive to that, given that that's my job.
Living it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But I think that teaching is, we don't want to get into politics here, but teachers are being told what they can teach. Teachers are being told that they don't, people don't want their kids to see anything bad about the culture and the history of the country. So if you're a history teacher, I'm not a history teacher, but, I do a lot of history.
Yeah.
If I mean, just the stuff we're talking about tonight. They're people say, well, they don't need to hear about that. They don't need to hear about that.
So you think even the good characteristic of I can figure it out and do it on my own and know a little bit about everything. It's interesting you said that because I grew up with my dad. My dad is third or fourth generation Arkansan, which makes me, I think, fifth generation. And I thought that was a family trait. I thought that attitude of like, I can figure it out. I don't need anybody. I'm not going to pay somebody to do that. I'm going to make it happen on my own. I thought that was a Plunkett family trait. And you're now telling me, no, that's part of being in the Ozarks.
Yeah, it's the Plunketts are longtime Ozarkers.
Yeah, that's been passed down. I did not think about that. That's really cool. You're saying some of that may even be kind of overpowering social progress in some ways.
Well,
of like,
I listed that
as
a positive side of it, though. There. You would ask for something positive,
right? Maybe it's too strong in some ways.
It might be too strong, but it certainly is a good thing.
Yeah,
a sense of competence
mm-hmm.
and competence in the family unit.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to stress it's for the man and the woman together. That as parents, you want to feel like you want your kids to feel like you've got it.
Mm-hmm.
You got it under control.
So you see those two things as two pretty distinct ideas.
And then the education, I think, is the drawback that we, just statistically, we have very low graduation rates and things like that.
What were some examples of? We mentioned two major publications that were really a published image of Arkansas that kind of personified this time. Why do you think those are so important?
Well, they're Arkansas has a minuscule role in both of these books. I think there's exactly one reference to Arkansas in Moby Dick. But what it does, and Moby Dick comes out in 1851, and we've been talking about things that were published in the 40 or 50 year period just before that, right? So here's the reference in Moby Dick. It comes near the end when the climactic battle with the whale is going on. And Ahab he gets in one of the boats, right, to go pursue the whale. And he attempts, and this is the line. He says he attempts with a 6-inch blade. So he has a big bread knife type thing, to pierce the fathom deep heart of the whale. Well, in other words, he's an idiot. The guy has a 6-inch blade, and he's going after a 6-foot deep part of the whale. So just on the surface, it shows the guy as deranged, and of course he dies. He gets tangled up in the rope and gets hauled off by the whale. But what it shows you is that in the phrase he says that action is like an Arkansas duelist. Okay. And so by 1851, that image of violence in the state was so well established that a writer writing about, he couldn't be further from Arkansas. He's somewhere in the South Pacific hunting whales, but he uses that as to make his point. So the image of Arkansas is so well imprinted then that in a book published, not for a regional audience, but for a national audience, so the image of violence is there. The other one, 25 years later, Huckleberry Finn, it's stupidity. It's stupidity that's on display. You remember there's these two bad guys in the Duke and the King. And they go from town to town and they put on a show, the Royal Nonesuch. And it's, and they try to advertise it as a kind of hoochie coochie show, that it's going to have some blue stuff in it, right? And so there's a page in there where one of them is putting up a sign. And he tells all this stuff. And at the bottom it says, women at the price, and it says women and children not admitted. And he steps back to admire his work, and he says something like, I'm quoting, but it's real close. He says, there. He says, if that don't get him, I don't know Arkansas. And that's, that's, so he's just saying these are gullible fools.
Right.
We put this up, and women and children not admitted. That makes them think there's going to be a lot of, hanky-panky type stuff in this show. And they got nothing. They're two guys. They're two old guys. They're not traveling with any, two-headed beasts or beautiful women or anything like that.
Right.
They're going to put on this silly show. Two of the most famous novels in American literature. And by 1851 and, 1870, 1880, the image of Arkansas as a place of tremendous violence and kind of gullibility are firmly established.
Yeah, well enough that the reference in these books is so well understood that the author doesn't even question to include them.
No.
People will understand what I mean.
That's right.
Gotcha.
That's right.
That is very interesting.
Yeah. I think, I could be wrong, but I think that's the only appearance of Arkansas.
Yeah. Man, that is cool. Okay, I wanted to kind of to wrap it up, and this is actually how I remember you wrapped up the article, and I thought it was a really good insight into people, into different perspectives. You say at the end of the article, as you show the detractors, the early gentlemen, kind of, basically giving Arkansas hell, right? Like they don't like it at all. Then you show Gear-Stalker, the deer slayer, and you mentioned people like Turnbo, these people who would be for the Ozarks and for these places and the people in them. And you close the article with a line that basically says, I wrote it down here, it's, who you are shapes what you see. What you bring is what you take away. And to me, I resonate with that a lot because you see these very contrasting accounts, and depending on what their purpose was, what their mission was, and what they were looking for, they got two very different things out of their travels and their experiences. Why and how did you kind of come to that insight as something to kind of close the article and put a bow on it? Like, how did you arrive at that?
Well, maybe you might be giving me more credit than I deserve for sort of plotting it out. But I think that if I think what I'm really saying there is if you arrive at a place like Gear-Stalker did and you have positive expectations, then somehow that's going to be a kind of aura around you as you move through that world. You show up at these people's homes, and they're going to be able to read that you're looking down on them or not looking down on them, And he's not looking down on them, and he expects the best, and so he gets it. I mean, now there's obvious places where that would not do well for you, but in general, I think that what you see is you bring yourself. And he just happened to be a young guy who was a good hunter, and he came into this place where those things were going to help him, merge happily into that environment. Whereas these other poor bastards, I mean, they're terrified. They don't have any of the skills necessary. I mean, there I'd contrast schoolcraft with Gear-Stalker. I mean, they can't hunt anything, and he's a good hunter. And so when one night out of St. Louis, when Schoolcraft and Pettibone check into this settler's cabin, they look like Martians. The wife says, "What are you doing with this? With this your outfit? That would be their word. Your outfit is crazy for what you're trying to do." Whereas when Gear-Stalker shows up, he's got the right equipment. He knows how to handle it. He rides his horse in. He knows what he's doing. So yeah, I mean, I think, but the moral side of it, when you expect good things, you get good things.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dr. Cochran, we really appreciate your time and have enjoyed hearing your stories, hearing the stories of your work, and really what you've kind of devoted your life to and telling the stories of these people and just learning about the folklore of this area and other places. So we really appreciate your time and for saving this place for us here at the Pryor Center. It's been a pleasure hanging out with you.
Well, it's been a pleasure for me.